Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade. I'm one of your hosts, Tim O'Toole, and with me today is my friend, colleague, and co-host, Laura Deegan. Laura, welcome.
Hi, glad to be here and glad to have recently joined the firm.
Yeah, it's great to have you. For those of you who haven't met Laura before, Laura is a new addition to Miller & Chevalier. She came over recently from the Office of Foreign Assets Control, where she was working for a few years and has had extensive experience in the sanctions industry before that. So we're really lucky to have her and lucky to have her on the podcast. So welcome again.
Thank you.
So today we decided to have an emergency podcast, which is taking place after a relatively, long for embargoed hiatus. We've been off for the last 2 months or so because it has been extremely busy in other parts of life and work and that sort of thing. But we're coming back to a regular schedule, and we wanted to jump right in because we did have a very interesting and important development in Venezuela on October 18th of last week. And we thought that it was important enough to just go to the recording studio and start talking about what happened in Venezuela. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to talk a little bit about kind of the three things that OFAC did last week as part of, I think, the negotiations that are going on with respect to the elections in Venezuela and the progress towards democratic elections. And so now I'll turn it over to you, Laura, and then we'll talk a little bit about each one of these three developments.
Yeah, very, very exciting time to be working in this space. As you know, we've seen some change and some sanctions relief in regards to Venezuela after having had, a more restrictive program for the past couple of years. So last week, on the 18th specifically, OFAC came out with frequently asked questions and additional guidance that they were issuing essentially certain Venezuela sanctions relief in exchange for an announcement from the government of Venezuela that they would be engaging in sort of free and fair elections and certain commitments that they'd made to the Venezuelan opposition government as well in terms of the 2024 Venezuela elections. So as part of this relief, we saw OFAC issue a few general licenses, and there's really three key ones to be concerned with here. And so the first we have Venezuela General License 44, which authorizes all transactions related to oil and gas sector operations in Venezuela. And as part of that, authorizes transactions ordinarily incident and necessary to financial transactions with certain blocked Venezuelan banks. So for U.S. persons to be able to process transactions through these certain blocked banks. And that one's really, important because obviously there's been a lot of sanctions on the government of Venezuela, including PDVSA the past few years. And PDVSA itself is a blocked person. And a lot of companies had honestly pulled out of oil and gas operations in Venezuela. And so that general license really is a big, move forward in terms of what U.S. persons can do, which we'll kind of touch on a little later. The other general licenses to be aware of are GL3I and GL9H. And these are iterations of previous general license issued before, which had allowed U.S. persons to divest certain government of Venezuela or PDVSA issued bonds to non-U.S. persons. So it effectively banned secondary trading in the market for these previously issued bonds. GL3I and 9H now authorize that secondary trading. So U.S. persons can purchase bonds on the annexes to each of these licenses, which is also a big change because before the iteration of this license, U.S. persons were really cut out of some of the discussions related to restructuring of Venezuelan debt. So that's a big one as well, which we'll touch on. And then the third one, the fourth general license, which we'll touch on, is Venezuela General License 43. And that authorizes transactions involving Minerva, which is Venezuela's state-owned gold mining company. And so this one is another one like General License 44, which authorizes, really these transactions involving the state-owned company that were not previously authorized, in an attempt really to, I think, try to normalize some business relations between the U.S. and Venezuela. And what's interesting about this general license as opposed to 44 is that this general license is not time limited, while as general license 44 related to Venezuela actually expires in 6 months to be able to give the U.S. government time to see if the government of Venezuela really follows through on its commitments made to the Venezuelan opposition.
Yeah, I mean, these were big developments that we were kind of expecting for a while. There was some noise about it. There was the Chevron general license that came out. I guess it's probably been close to a year ago now, but they were related to the negotiations that are going on in Mexico City about elections in Venezuela, and this seems to be kind of the first major step towards easing sanctions in exchange for progress in connection with those negotiations. Let's kind of work backwards. I think with respect to the General License 43, with respect to the bond, which dealt with the state-owned gold company, and with respect to the other two general licenses that dealt with the secondary markets for certain bonds. I think, what there is to say, I think you've mostly already said it in the sense that, the GL43 is not time limited. So it is a big change, and one that I think can pretty easily induce reliance interests, and the other GLs are not time limited either. And if you want to figure out which bonds that they affect, you can go to the list in connection with, to the appendix in connection with the general licenses. And so the ramifications of those GLs are pretty easy to understand. The gold sector now in Venezuela is basically open for business. You still have to be careful, but it's changed, and at least for the foreseeable future. But I think what I wanted to focus on more now is GL44, because that involves the Venezuelan oil and gas sector. And given that Venezuela has the world's largest petroleum reserves, it's a big deal that PDVSA was on the SDN list as of October 17th with no meaningful, general licenses or other authorizations that would allow transactions with PDVSA, except for maybe, the Chevron joint venture general license from, a few months or maybe a year ago. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of how broad this general license is? Because some of the language in the general license struck me as extremely broad, but then some of the other language in the general license struck me as somewhat unusual. So I want to walk through some of the nuances of GL44 to get some discussion, or to get some idea of how big a change this is.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that, Tim, we had previously discussed is if you look at the authorization in General License 44, and specifically, the chunk of this is in paragraph A, it authorizes all transactions essentially that are related to oil and gas sector operations in Venezuela. And this oil and gas sector operations sort of as a sector is not necessarily a term that OFAC has defined in terms of Venezuela, and really in terms of other sanctions regulations. So if you look to other programs such as Belarus or Ukraine, you see targeted sanctions on the energy sector of those countries. Obviously, with Iran, you see petroleum sanctions, and then you have related definitions of what's petroleum, what's energy sector. But really, we don't see a true definition of what is oil and gas operations in OFAC regulations. And I think, what we can look to is there are certain FAQs that existed prior to this general license that really talked about PDVSA's oil and gas operations in terms of Chevron general license, et cetera. And so I think you can look to some of those FAQs to really figure out what oil and gas operations is. But I also think that there's a big argument that the use of the terms related to is not something that OFAC uses often in general licenses. It's usually your ordinarily incident and necessary to language. We've seen related to language in other general licenses, such as AgMed related general licenses and things like that, where OFAC is really meant to authorize a large swath of activity. And I think there's a good argument here that, a lot of PDVSA's business is arguably related to oil and gas operations, so that U.S. persons might get a little comfort from engaging in business with PDVSA, knowing that their activity would be covered under this general license.
Yeah, I mean, that's what struck me, on the reading of it was both of the things that you just talked about, Laura. One was the related to language, which, as you pointed out, has been, used increasingly when OFAC wants to encourage activity in a particular area. And then, and is broader than the ordinarily incident and necessary to. It may mean the same thing in practice, but it certainly indicates an intent to go more broadly. And then this oil and gas sector operations also strikes more broadly, maybe not as broadly as the energy sector, but it certainly goes pretty broad in terms of the oil and gas sector operations in Venezuela. Covers a lot of things. I guess as I was getting ready for the podcast, I was reading this closely, and it also intentionally seems to go broader than just PDVSA. So PDVSA is mentioned explicitly, I think, to make clear that this includes PDVSA, but it's all transactions prohibited that are related to the oil and gas sector operations in Venezuela. As a practical matter, many of those are going to involve PDVSA, but you don't have to have PDVSA involved in the transaction for this GL to apply. And it expressly carves out new investment as well. So you don't have any questions about that. And as you mentioned, from a U.S. person standpoint, a lot of the questions that we'd had in the past as to, are there things, there's a legal services general license, but it's the normal GL for legal services. So it's relatively narrow with respect to what lawyers can do. I think this GL, from a legal services perspective, certainly would allow U.S. persons to provide legal services that are in support of all of these items on the list, and really any activities that are related to the oil and gas sector operations in Venezuela, because those would be transactions that would otherwise be prohibited that are now related to oil and gas sector operations. So just from a legal services perspective, I think that this has really increased what lawyers, U.S. lawyers could do with respect to transactions in Venezuela. And I suspect there's lots of other professions and service providers and that sort of thing that would be within the scope of this general license, even though their business isn't limited to oil and gas sector operations. Because if the work that you're doing is related to those operations, you were prohibited on October 17th, and now you're not. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you could think of a whole host of other types of services, construction, et cetera, where those services might be covered under the GL. One thing I did want to mention, because you touched a little bit on new investment, something else that's a little bit interesting about this general license is you can see, there are exceptions to the general license, which wouldn't allow new investment in the sector by a person located, or an entity owned or controlled by a person located in the Russian Federation, which is obviously very interesting, because I think it shows a policy message here that, we're trying to normalize relations with Venezuela if we can. We are still tough on Russia. That came across to me as the message there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's a policy, there's a broader policy that I think this reflects, which is that the U.S., I think, is trying to the extent that the sanctions have demonstrably changed policy, at least to some extent, in a better direction from the U.S. perspective. They're trying to bring Venezuelan oil back onto the markets, but at the same time, have Venezuela have more U.S. facing and potentially more non-Russia facing counterparts than were taking place previously. And I think that's why you see the carve out for persons located in the Russian Federation, or even entities owned or controlled by persons located in the Russian Federation. A few other carve-outs on this. They still do carve out a couple of Venezuelan banks, including the central bank, from the transactions, and then also, the debtor equity to the Venezuelan government is also carved out from this. So one thing that jumped out at me is that when in dealing with the sectoral sanctions in the Russian in the Ukraine related Russian program, one thing that often came up, and I guess there's some of those in the 14024 program as well, but one thing that also comes up in business transactions is, can the provision of, if you provide goods and there's delayed payment, is that a form of debt? And potentially, it is here. So you do have to think hard about whether those prohibitions would apply in that sort of debt context. But otherwise, I think most of the sanctions that would apply to these transactions appear to be lifted.
Yeah, and I think, on that point, I think if you are making investments relating to the oil and gas sector involving PDVSA, you just also have to be careful to structure those investments so that it doesn't really look like debt. It's not like you're getting, loaning funds in order to get interest payments or things like that.
Yeah. I think that's really the two big caveats that I would give to companies that are thinking of kind of going now into the oil and gas sector in Venezuela are make sure there's no Russian persons or companies involved, and make sure that you've thought about the debt, the no new debt issue. Well, and then the big thing that I would want to talk to people about, and I think you've already touched on it a little bit. This thing only lasts 6 months, and so if I'm a company thinking about going into this oil and gas sector in Venezuela, and I know that next April this could all go away, can you walk us through a little bit the thought process that companies may have in terms of, why would they want to rely on this when it could otherwise go away in 6 months?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm also coming from a place of having worked in several financial institutions, especially during the JCPOA era. And a lot of institutions, likewise with Venezuela, and companies had pulled out of Venezuela. They were de-risking on a large scale because of some of these complex sanctions and how much the government of Venezuela really imperviates a lot of Venezuelan economy activity. And so I think you might see businesses and financial institutions who are processing transactions for example, international and U.S. businesses being a bit hesitant at first, perhaps to, wanting to go back into Venezuela. But I think, on the other hand, and we've discussed this, if relations with Venezuela turn positive and there's a positive change in Venezuela in terms of the 2024 elections, companies also don't want to be the last one in. So, they want to get they want to get in first to be able, to say they had done that. And I think that if you see hesitancy on a part of U.S. or international companies to get in, there's always going to be that fear. On the other hand, I think that companies do have to watch closely what happens with Venezuela over the next 6 months. I think already we're seeing in the news reports that the government had supposedly taken down websites related to opposition voting polling, and there had been allegations of voter fraud in terms of opposition primaries that happened recently. So I think, you want to be mindful if you're a company looking to go back into Venezuela of what's going on really on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis, really with the hope that if you are engaging in transactions under this license, that relations continue to improve.
Yeah, I think this is, to start with, if you're thinking of going in to this area, I think a Google alert on Venezuelan elections is imperative, because that's going to be critical to how long you can stay. And I think, you just talked about kind of the bad news on this is that we're already seeing signs that potentially the government is doing things that would not be consistent with free and fair elections coming up. You can be sure that OFAC is watching for those signs. And even if it weren't, you can be sure that the opposition is going to make sure that OFAC knows about those signs if that were to happen. Although I think there is a balance, right? Because I think that it's in Venezuela's interest generally to want this industry to get back up off the ground if you can do it in a way that doesn't run into the problems that happened before with respect to what the U.S. perceived as the Maduro government essentially funding itself based on the oil wealth. But I think that, on the other hand, if the opposition were to win and take over the government, I think it would much rather that PDVSA be in a place that it will, potentially be 6 months from now or a year from now, and have a functioning, kind of much more highly functioning oil industry in Venezuela than happened, during the sanctions period. I guess the question, the good news on this side, at least I view it as good news. Again, it's more tea leaf reading. Is not only does the opposition have some reliance interests, I think the U.S. government does too. I think it's invested in this process in the sense that it issued this general license in a way that I assume that they want it to succeed. So as long as things don't deteriorate too much, I would think that it would be renewed. Now that is not a certainty, but I would guess that the presumption from the policymakers and OFAC would be, if the status quo basically continues, with some ebbs and flows, that the GL will be renewed. If the status quo changes materially, then this all could go away in 6 months. I mean, what are your thoughts about that, about kind of where the policymakers would be if we're basically in the same spot 6 months from now?
I think you're right. Your inclination is right that if really there haven't been material changes and, there haven't been any huge action by the government really sabotaging events up until the 2024 Venezuela election, that you'll see probably a renewal of this general license. I think that what then companies will have to look out for, to be honest, is what happens in the 2024 U.S. election, which we talked about a little bit. Because if you've also been following the news in relation to this sanctions relief, you would know that there are members of the Republican Party who are not very happy with these general licenses. So in the fact that we do have a change in party in terms of the White House and, other areas of government, you could see a reversal or a revocation of this type of relief at that point. So that is just, it's really meant to say that companies just really need to be on notice for the next, 6 to 12 months, depending on what happens.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good bottom line here, is that this creates opportunity. And as you pointed out, Laura, it's opportunity that if you get in now, you may, and this lasts, you may be very glad to be the first in. And if you're not the first in, you may be very sad about that. On the other hand, it is very precarious because not only, do we have to wonder whether the general license will be renewed 6 months from now. And again, that's kind of a guess. I think it's, an educated guess that there will be a presumption in favor of renewal absent some bad material circumstance, but there's no guarantee even of that. And then even if the general license is renewed for another 6 months, if a new administration comes in January of 2025, and it's not the Biden administration, I think there is a strong chance that this general license would go away completely if Maduro is still in power in Venezuela, regardless of what has been done to create fairness of the election. And even if I would hazard a guess that even if Maduro wins a free and fair election, that a new party might think about lifting this general license if there's any discussion that Maduro was responsible for some sort of election irregularities in the Venezuela elections. So that's just a wild guess, but I think it just creates, there's uncertainty with respect to this general license from whether even the current administration would renew it, but there's a lot more uncertainty as to whether or not a new and different administration would renew it, regardless of the circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely right, but look, this is sort of like a huge step in terms of the program and just the breadth of the language in the general license, and then the other relief offered in terms of secondary trading and in GOV or PDVSA debt, I think is also a huge step in terms of relations between the US and Venezuela. And I think with all general licenses, usually there's obviously sometimes a lot of policy messaging behind it, where it's not just that the US government is authorizing certain activity, but, there could be a push to U.S. and international companies to renew their relations with Venezuela, especially in a time, where there's a war in Ukraine, and there's a lot of prohibitions relating to Russian oil. I think there's a lot of there's reasons for the U.S. to put out relief such as this right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think we'll leave it there on General License 44. Anything to say about gold that we haven't already said?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that was really interesting, not so much in the general license, but in OFAC FAQ, is that so there are authorities in the Venezuela program that allow the U.S. to target persons operating in the gold sector. And so what the FAQ had said is that the U.S. doesn't essentially intend to operate persons solely for operating in the gold sector of the Venezuelan economy, but that relief is also contingent.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I thought that was interesting. It was there's this broad designation authority, but we're not going to use it now that we've got this in play. So it's another kind of like within connection with General License 44, where they use this broad language. Here, the language in the GL isn't as broad, but that FAQ was basically a message that the Venezuelan gold sector is open for business at least as long as GL 43 is in place.
Yeah, and the fact that it's not time limited, I think that's a much different risk for any company that's looking to get involved with Minervan.
Yep. All right. Well, what about the secondary market for these bonds, the GL3 and 9? Talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so like I said, that there was that period after 2017, and there were bans on secondary trading and primary trading in certain government of Venezuela and PDVSA debt. The previous general licenses, like I said, had allowed divestment of those bonds to non-U.S. persons, but really you were cutting U.S. investors out of the market of trying to gobble up Venezuelan distressed debt and taking away from them, in some sense, the ability to negotiate with the Venezuelan government when it came down to settling its own debt. So a lot of people, when the sanctions related to secondary trading were in place, were really pushing on the U.S. government to issue relief in the form of really what this general license does, which allows U.S. persons to go and buy on the secondary market, bonds in the annexes to these general licenses. And I think we've already seen impact in the market, because the bond prices of these particular bonds have risen quite fast in the past week. And I think we've seen some positive news from the Venezuelan Creditors Committee. They're welcoming this relief because they really think it'll help when it comes time to try to renegotiate Venezuelan debt.
All right. Well, so my bottom line on all of this is that it's early, but I'm pretty optimistic. But there's a lot of new opportunity out there in Venezuela that didn't exist last week, but it is complicated and precarious. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's all true. We still have Venezuelan sanctions in place. So just because we have this relief, still should worry about other designated parties in Venezuela. So hopefully the relief will continue, but TBD.
Yep. And the general licenses really do emphasize that there are other prohibitions that are out there and they haven't been lifted. Yeah. So particularly in the oil and gas sector. So be careful if you're going to go there, but at least now, the answer to the question of what can we do in Venezuela has some things that U.S. companies might be interested in doing on it, even if it is still complicated.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. And to this new emergency podcast on Venezuela. We will see you next time. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us, Laura, in the first of what I hope is many appearances on this podcast. And stay sanctions free.
Produced by Heartcast Media.